everybody? Ross is upside down.
Well, my iPad won't open. Hello?
We have one appointment. Yes. Okay, that's what you were talking about,
Yeah.
Hillary.
I thought you were saying Alvin.
Good.
All right, we ready? Rod?
Yeah.
I'd like to call the Rules and City Government Committee to order. Please note for the record that all members are present and accounted for. First item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. I'll entertain a motion.
Move approval.
A second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, business before the committee. Approval of the minutes from the July 9th meeting.
Which is quite a while ago. I move approval. We're back with the budget
Second.
stuff.
All right. Moved in second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, appointments and reappointments to committees. We have one appointment of Mr. Al Collins to the Civil Service Board. Ms. Ratrovich, would you like to speak for him since I don't see him in the audience?
Good evening. Mr. Collins is traveling and couldn't be here tonight, but I said I would come on his behalf. I think at least a few of you are familiar with Mr. Collins. He has a very impressive resume, including being the Secretary of General Services for the state of Maryland. He was Chief of Staff in Anne Arundel County as well. This is a board that is doing very important work right now with the comp and class study, and they're sorely in need of new members. I think they currently have 3 out of the 5 positions filled on the Civil Service Board, and Mr. Collins would bring a long history of working with employees and understanding contracts to this board.
Okay, any questions?
No, I think he is very impressive. I would move we recommend approval.
Second.
No, hearing no further discussion. All in favor of approving, recommending Mr. Al Collins to the Civil Service Board, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, moving right along. Legislation before the committee. 02119, moderately priced dwelling units. Dr. Nash, are you here to speak on this piece of legislation?
Hello, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
This legislation makes several changes to our existing NPDU legislation. It went to the Planning Commission, and they recommended a few amendments. I also have some other amendment language one from Alderman Rodriguez and one from the developers of 2010 West Street.
Okay, would you like to start with the Planning Commission's recommendations? And are you making those recommendations also?
Yes, so they generally recommended approval of the amendments, including eliminating the fee in lieu, providing 15% of the units to be MPDUs in an approved development that's for both rental and for sale housing, and extending the occupancy period for MPDUs. Their amendments, one were to rename the title of the Homeownership Assistance Trust Fund. They proposed Housing Trust Fund. although Alderman Rodriguez actually subsequently proposed a slightly different, it would be Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
So the First Amendment is to simply change the title from Home Ownership Assistance Trust Fund to Housing Trust Fund.
To either what the Planning Commission recommended or Alderman Rodriguez would prefer, Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
Well, what is the pleasure of the committee? I was thinking we'd go through the Planning Commission's recommendations first and then look at the other recommendations. If they conflict, then we can come back and change, I think.
I can just review all the amendments and then you can decide what action you want to take on any of, if you want to forward any of them.
Mm-hmm. Alderman Arnett?
I'm indifferent, whatever is most efficient.
Okay. Do you want to go on to amendment number 2 from the Planning Commission?
Okay, the second amendment is to let's see, it is on page, hold on, I need to check.
Page 4.
On page 5 of their report to the City Council. And it is to exempt properties that are in accordance with the minimum income standards of Section 42 of the federal IRS regulations. So I'll explain this one. For when we developed our MPDUs, we didn't really take into account a situation where public housing development, like a HACA-owned property or a property that is getting tax credits, would be coming in, and whether those units would be considered the same as MPDUs or different, because they do have slightly different eligibility requirements in our MPDU program. So because we didn't specifically exempt them, we are now making developments like at 2010 West Street, where they're doing low-income tax credit housing. We're making them identify some units that will be part of the MPDU program. The problem is that the requirements of our MPDU program, especially the residency requirement that the applicant has to be a resident of the city of Annapolis, conflicts with some of the requirements of the organizations that fund these groups. So they can't get financing if they have to meet our requirements, because they contradict the requirements of their financing group. So they asked if they could be exempt from MPDU program because they're targeting the same income groups. It's just slightly different eligibility criteria. So they're asking for language to specifically exempt them, which we think makes sense because we want to encourage tax credit projects. And if what they're going to be providing are pretty much equivalent to what we would get through our MPDU program, we don't see why they should have to also require our MPDUs.
I guess I'm a little confused. First of all, you mentioned HACA's conflict. I'm not clear why HACA would be considered or eligible for MPDUs.
Well, if they redeveloped and it was more than 10 units, then according to Title 20, they would have to designate some of those units as MPDU units. But basically, their whole product is for low-income and extremely low-income people. So it wouldn't really make sense to require them to provide MPDUs. But as the code is written now, they would have to provide them.
So does this clarify that?
Yes, so this would exempt HACA properties and any properties that are getting tax credits in order to provide low-income residents with housing.
Okay. And the project on West Street, and I'm not that familiar with what that project is. Is that a moderately priced, a low-income priced? Where does that fall in the scheme of housing cost?
It overlaps with the lower end of our MPDU program, but it also provides housing for even a lower income segment of the population.
Okay, so they would be eligible for MPDUs for that section that's on the higher end?
So it's possible that someone in Annapolis who could meet our MPDU requirements would also be eligible for that housing. Yes.
Okay. So does Amendment 2 address that issue?
Yes, although again, I have slightly different language that I would propose for the committee to consider than what is in the Planning Commission report.
Okay. Do you want to hear Sally's propose, or do you want to go through all the planning commissions?
I think that is those are the two Planning Commission amendments.
Okay. All right, would you like to give us your recommendation?
Is this related to the two planning commission amendments?
This is equivalent to their second amendment. It's
Okay.
just slightly reworded to be clear from a legal point of view. So it states that a development that sets aside affordable dwelling units in accordance with Section 42 of the Federal Internal Revenue Code, pursuant to which a restricted covenant is to be recorded in the land records of Anne Arundel County, setting forth income limitations of tenants in accordance with the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program in favor of the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development or a subsidiary thereof, or another governmental entity responsible for administration of the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. So the amendment, as proposed by the Planning Commission, would add projects that meet that definition to the list of projects that are exempt from MPDUs.
So where would this go in the legislation?
It would go in Section 2030-030 B4. Or I can give you
So
the
page
Okay.
5. So it will replace the 4 that's in the planning commissions.
That's right.
It's 20030 what?
030.
20030.
So in the ordinance itself, it would be on page 5, and then it would be line 16. Be a new number 4. Though I see in the ordinance there's 2 V's, but
Hey,
Well, they've renumbered
mm,
and moved
I think
second B
the
to
second B
C
should be C.
and the C to D. Okay, what is the pleasure of the committee? We're looking at the Second Amendment.
I'm in favor of both of the amendments and with plan and zoning's correction or clarification.
Well, she's giving us a different amendment than the Planning Commission's for number 2. The Planning Commission has 2 amendments.
It's essentially the same as the Planning Commission's second amendment, just a little bit of it's worded a little bit differently.
Still meets the intention, though, right?
Yes.
I think that Dr. Nash's is more clear. What about, well, one of the sponsors is already gone. Have you discussed this with the sponsors? Do they know about this language?
Yes, I discussed it with them a couple of times and mentioned it again last week. So.
Okay. So the general intent of this, it seems to me, is to make MPDUs available longer. And so I subscribe to the general intent of the legislation, although I do think we have a member of the audience that wants to talk about some other parts of it. I think that the language that Sally is offering in substitute for the language the Planning Commission would be what I would favor recommending to the council.
And Madam Chair, just so you're aware, I also have an amendment, Alderman Rodriguez and I.
Okay.
So whenever you want to get to it, I just
Okay.
want to let you know.
Mr. Hyde, do you want to speak to this amendment that Dr. Nash is proposing? Okay. 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 So what is the pleasure of the committee? Do we want to take a motion to support the Planning Commission's, well, Dr. Nash's amendment through the Planning Commission, the Planning Commission's.
Dr. Nash's version of amendment number 2 for the
Right.
planning, from the Planning Commission, and accept amendment number 1 from the Planning Commission.
Although
Do we want to
the
take
amendment
this-
number 1 has also been slightly tweaked by Alderman Rodriguez.
So let's take the second one, because that's what we're
Okay.
dealing with right now. So the motion is to support the amendment that Dr. Nash provided us.
I'll move to
So it's been
recommend
moved
favorably
and
Amendment 2
second.
as, yes.
Okay. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Takia, did you get that? Ms. Green, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's go back to the first amendment from the Planning Commission. And
The first one is just really about what the best name for this fund is. And so what Alderman Rodriguez prefers is the Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
And do we know why?
Well, the idea is that we will be able to use the money that's in there, which isn't a whole lot of money, in kind of towards a broader purpose of supporting affordable housing. Now, its title is a little misleading with housing trust fund. So it's really just to clarify or to kind of help support the mission of this fund. This fund is where money from the fee in lieu goes. If this ordinance goes ahead as written, there won't be a fee in lieu anymore. So Alderman Rodriguez is looking for other ways we can add to this fund. But,
And what are they?
well, he's still looking at that. So he's looking at other jurisdictions to see what they do.
So we have a fund that won't have any money in it, but we're worried about the name of it?
Alderman Savage.
Well, I mean, since it's just a name change, I'd be inclined to support it.
I agree.
Okay. Further discussion? Hearing none. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor of the Rodriguez amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay. So that takes care of the Planning Commission's proposed amendment, which we've replaced both of them with council and staff amendments. Alderman Savage, you said you had an amendment for this legislation?
Yes. So, oh, yeah, thank you. So this amendment, so as one of the co-sponsors, this was, I think, Alderman Rodriguez and I, our intention from the get-go, but we just missed it in the drafting. So this has to do with the applicability and which projects it applies to. The current language, let me bring it up here. The current language, so if you're looking at the last page 7, at the very bottom on lines 41, it says section 2, and that's where it talks about the applicability. So it says development applications submitted to the department prior to the effective date. Basic grandfathers, anything that has an application submitted. Probably no surprise to you that I'd like to try to change that. The standard that Alderman Rodriguez and I are proposing is simply to strike lines 41 through 45 and then the next 2 lines on the next page. This is what the law office said would be most effective to achieve the applicability standard that we want. The standard that we're looking for is to, if they have approval, then they're exempted, they're grandfathered. But if they don't yet have approval, we would like to hold them to the new MPDU standard.
So let me ask the question. If someone is in the process, but they haven't gotten final approval, you're saying that they, what do they do?
Well, they would have to comply with the new standards. And the
And
approval...
the new standards are more number of units held in MPDU for a longer period of time.
Yes, and the approval, the point of approval would be site design approval. And so that is kind of in the middle of the process, because after that you have final, after that comes grading and building permit review, and before site design comes the concept review. So yeah, it's kind of in the middle.
Let me ask Dr. Nash her opinion on this.
So we have 2 projects, I believe, that would be affected by this. One, it wouldn't be a big deal because they're very early on in the process. One, however, has been in the process for a long time, 8 years, and they've already paid us a fee in lieu. They don't have specifically site design because it's a planned development. So maybe this wouldn't affect them one way or the other. Because if you're doing planned development, you still have to meet the site design standards, but you get a planned development number, not a site design number. So maybe that's okay, then they could continue on because they're a planned development.
Can I ask a question? So, yeah, because I was assuming, I guess, well, when they pay the fee in lieu, do they do that once, presumably once they already have approval?
Usually, and I'm actually not 100% sure if we've collected the money, but we've already agreed that they can pay the fee in lieu. And they have proceeded for 8-7 years now with that understanding. So,
Well, at least from my standpoint, in terms of the sponsor behind the amendment, I mean, I'd say, yeah, if they've already paid and have some level of approval, it's not my intention to say, no, here's your money back, we want you to do it.
okay, all right.
But if they're still in the process of being reviewed in discussions with planning and zoning, then we would like to have them
Okay.
work in the MPDU. So it sounds like the other project you're saying, though, wouldn't be a big deal?
I don't think
you
so because
think?
they're not very far along,
Okay.
so I don't think it would matter.
So 2 projects, potentially, or 1 or 2, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, right. So I think if that's the intent, then I think we'll be okay. We'll be okay.
So no one would be grandfathered in
Well, yes, we have some properties that would be grandfathered in that have project approval already, but maybe don't have their building permits or their grading permits.
And
Those
so-
would be
So
grandfathered.
how would this impact those projects?
It would not, this legislation would not impact,
Okay.
would not.
Okay, Mr. Hyatt, you want to speak to this? Okay.
I'm not sure, for the record, Alan Hyatt, 200 Westgate Circle in Annapolis. I'm not sure if Dr. Nash, are you talking about the project, the Bambi Beach project? Okay. See, that project, and that's in your ward, Alderman Savage, I think you've met with these people, and it has been a long, difficult struggle for a variety of reasons, and the project was granted the payment in lieu for MPDU purposes, but it also has been designed in a way that certain tolerances are allowed. You know, under the former law, you were allowed certain tolerances for then payment in lieu, and this project is quite far along, and to impose the
Well,
new
he's
obligation.
saying it wouldn't apply, that would be
Well, but
grandfathered.
no, you said payment. They haven't made the payment. They've
Right, but we have an agreement that they will do the
Right.
payment. Right.
okay, but I mean, how do you distinguish that? Because I think it would be difficult. It would be
Right.
very burdensome on a project that's been designed and is maybe not quite through the process. Not just that one, but there's a few others that are out there to switch to a requirement that you must have 15% both rental and for sale units, and then you don't get these tolerances potentially. I just don't think it's a fair and reasonable approach. There aren't that many projects in the pipeline around here that would be impacted, but the costs to redesign and go through the whole process, I think that's extremely burdensome. If you know what you're dealing with going in, and that you know there cannot be a fee in lieu and there must be 15% allocated to both for sale and for rentals, that's one thing. But projects that have been designed, they may not have been approved, but there's iterations that have gone back and forth, and I just don't think that's a fair and reasonable approach to take.
Well, yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I mean, with the Chesapeake or the Bembe, I can't recall the name. Bembe Beach project. Chesapeake Grove. Thank you. Yeah, I mean if they have an agreement, then that's something we'll have to talk to the law office about. But as an aside, I guess that's kind of what I'm looking to avoid is if a project. I don't want a project that's been in the pipeline for 8-10 years having to follow 8-year-old laws, right? I feel like at least my constituents expect, if we pass a law, they want it to apply to projects. That's kind of a long time, but if they've been, if they're still working on the process and they don't have approval yet. But as our director said, it's only 1 or 2 projects. It's not too many.
There's a few, and there's also a few that are being held up because of schools. There's a couple of the schools that are closed. I mean, the Parole Place is one that I'm involved in at the corner of Old Solomon's and Forest Drive. We have a school problem, so we can't go forward on the townhouse component. So I mean, it just the collateral damage, I'll call it, that is created when you change the law on a project that's in midstream. And I admit the one that's dragged on 7 or 8 years, that's unusual. But they've had a lot of different, mostly environmental issues that they're trying to overcome. But some of these other projects, they just can't move but so fast through the process. And I think that the language, I mean, I have some problems with the bill altogether, but the grandfathering language, I think, is how you treat fairly the projects that are in the pipeline.
Dr. Nash, how do we deal with adequate facilities? Mr. Hyatt mentioned schools. So what role does the adequacy of schools play into a project or into, this decision as far as grandfathering?
Well, as far as MPDUs are,
Do we consider school capacity when we are determining where the project is in the pipeline?
well, if, for example, a school was closed and you could get a conditional approval for your site design, and it would just be that you're on the waiting list for that school to open. So you would still essentially have your approval. You would just be on a waiting list. Then you would be grandfathered from this legislation if that were the case.
Okay. So that would not impact a project that's closed or is waiting for capacity, school
Right.
capacity.
If Parole Place, for example, had all of its approvals except for the school district, which actually, by the way, Alan, is now open.
It's open?
It's now open as of July 1st. Then they would still be considered grandfathered, even when this went into effect. But Parole Place was the one I was speaking of as being fairly early on in the process. And maybe Mr. Hyatt wants to speak to that, but that's one at this time. I wouldn't think this legislation would have such a big impact, although it's true they have had they had the expectations of our existing law when they conceived the project and brought the initial concept to us, but that he can speak to that.
How do we codify an agreement with a developer? For example, with the Bemby Beach project, you said you all have an understanding about the fee in lieu of. Is there something in writing or?
There's a letter from the director to the developer saying you can, because of X, Y, and Z, because you basically can't meet the density requirements and therefore aren't eligible for density or can't take advantage of a density bonus, you're allowed to pay into the fee in lieu program as an alternative to providing an MPDU. And it's a letter. So you could put, it would have to be incorporated into the amendment somehow unless there's been an agreement, a previous agreement. I'm not sure. We would probably need to talk to the law office about how exactly that would need to be worded.
I am concerned about fairness and people who are in the project and in the process. And then we change the rules. I mean, we've gone round and round with this with any number of pieces of legislation. I want to make sure that we don't do something with this legislation that's going to impact somebody who has been working with us, fairly and trying to get through our process, and then we put up a wall. So that's my concern. So what's your?
In state law, I believe if legislation is changed, the new legislation is what obtains. And I think there's been lots of, we have lawyers who can speak to this better than I, but lots of case law that have upheld that. So I understand your fairness point, but on the other hand, if the legislation is important enough to make a change, it would seem to me that you would at that point want to start making the changes that the legislators intended.
Well, I think this legislation, like all of our legislation, speaks to taking effect when the legislation is passed.
Right.
But I think we have a bigger responsibility not to sidestep any other law, but to make sure that our laws are fair and equitable for everyone.
So,
And so I'm not debating your point, but, you know,
so there are special circumstances, and I will point to the project at the Eastport Shopping Center, where I have agreed to have a enforcement clause that does not impair that project. So in that specific case, we're writing things. There's another one coming up, I think it's 2019, where we're going to have to deal with that again. I've made an agreement as the alderman of the ward with the developers that on certain pieces of legislation, I make sure that the enactment clause doesn't come back and zap them after all of their years in the process. So it's a proactive action on my part rather than a generic action in terms of when we pass the law.
so you're using a different terminology because we're talking about grandfathering in
Well, but what
projects that are,
to me, if there is a particular project that is 8 years old or has some other compelling argument, I could see making the amendments that are called for here, but also have a specific piece of language in addition to this enabling section that carves out a particular project.
Dr. Nash, what do you think?
Oops. I mean, generally, I would be concerned about the fairness as well, but if we can exempt the long beleaguered project on Bemby Beach Road, we can ask Mr. Hyatt about Parole Place, but I believe that is the only development that would be affected. So I don't think that that's too problematic because he's early on in the process. But to the best of my knowledge, those are the only two that don't have project approval and have to provide MPDUs.
Mr. Hyatt, are there other projects that you can name that we should be concerned about?
Well, you know, Alderman Arnett raised a good question. How about Eastport, the Eastport Shopping Center? We have site design plan approval, but there's no footings in the ground, you know, in order to have vesting, as you alluded to. When you adopt the law, there has to be something tangible done. So, I asked rhetorically, would Eastport Shopping Center be impacted if you take away the grandfathering? It might be. And so I think there may be 4 or 5 projects in the city. Maybe less.
Right. Okay. If that is the language, then there would be a lot more projects. I understood the language to exempt projects with planning approval. In your amendment? For site design approval. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
So
I mean, it's kind of, that was the language that this was the method the law office suggested be used to accomplish our goal of, if they have site design, if they already have MPD or site design approval.
Yeah.
I mean, believe me, I wanted to have it apply to all projects that are not vested, even if they have approval, but the co-sponsors weren't. I was one of the few. But so this is kind of a compromise on my end anyway. But I also, I just don't like the idea of exempting specific projects. I'd rather have it be based on specific points in the process, because that kind of, I don't know, favoritism but regarding the Chesapeake Beach, I mean, again, if this applies to them, then so be it. I mean, it'd only be 3 units, 4 units. It's not a huge deal with this project, but I'm also concerned, even if they have this letter that says you can pay the fee in lieu, how long does that last? I mean, is it going to be another 8 years and they're going to hold up this letter in 16 years and say, oh no, we're allowed to comply with this 8-year-old or 16-year-old law at this point? I mean, that's kind of, I'd hate to see those things drag on just because they're in the pipeline. So is there any kind of expiration to those kind of approvals or
No, I mean,
letters?
it's very unusual for a project to take that long in the pipeline. I mean, we have a long pipeline, but it's not usually that long. So it wouldn't, doesn't come up that much.
I mean, 'cause the point the sponsors, we really want to see, we want to maximize and start to do what we can to get this kind of housing stock in the city. The current program just isn't as effective as I think many of us want to see. I mean, if you look at some of the data that I've seen since 2004, it's only like a handful of projects out of all of those. Most of them end up paying the fee in lieu, and even that is just minimal amount of money. So, this is an attempt to kind of say, hey, it's not working. We want to be able to show some results to the residents of the city, and if that means an 8-year-old projects need to comply with the new law, then so be it as far as I'm concerned. But, I'm only one vote.
I feel like if we have in some way represented that they can proceed in this way, we should honor that. I think the question is, how can we put that in language that's general enough that includes that, but not specific to call out one particular project, which I agree with you about not wanting to do. But
Well, that's not what I'm interested in doing for my amendment. If the committee wants to do something to adjust it, then so be it. But I'm kind of just going to stick with the law office recommendation on the cutoff.
okay, and if a project doesn't have specific site design approval because it's a planned development and it gets planned development approval, would you consider, it seems like the intent would be to also include projects without planned development approval, because they essentially get site design approval, but they don't, it's not called that, it's called planned development approval. Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So your amendment wouldn't apply to these projects, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, which are both planned developments.
Yeah, well, it's probably a clarification for the law office.
Yeah.
I mean, they sent me an email saying that this is the best way. They said without an applicability clause, the standard for any new law is that before final approval, project is subject to all law changes. And so that's where the law office was suggesting just deleting this provision.
Suppose we ask the law department to give us another type of amendment that would speak to how to address the projects that are already in without naming them. I mean, the law department will give us whatever we ask for.
Yeah.
I didn't see this as a recommendation on how to handle the issue. Mm-hmm. You just asked for language from them.
Yeah, and if you want to do that, but I still want to move forward with this amendment that Alderman Rodriguez and I are promoting. I mean, to be frank, my constituents would be very happy if this development in my ward would have to comply with this for MPDU. Yeah.
Okay. I thought, did you say earlier, though, that since they already had this agreement, your intent wasn't to hold them up?
Well, if that's considered final approval, but if they don't have final approval, if it's not paid, then...
Okay.
Because I know once they actually have approval, the final approval does expire after a certain amount of time, right? Mm-hmm. And so that kind of avoids the issue that I'm trying to avoid, which is allowing project to just hold on to this approval indefinitely.
I see.
To avoid the law.
Okay.
So if they want to get moving here and meet the request of city staff and get their approval before this takes effect, then have at it.
I guess one of the things that's never been clear to me is what is the meaning of the word approval? I thought it was something like what you said, Dr. Nash, which is they have a letter from the planning department saying they're approved.
Well, let me clarify. They have a letter from the director saying they can pay a fee in lieu rather than provide an MPDU unit. They do not have plan development approval yet because they need to go to planning commission and get that approval.
When you say they, you're talking about Parole and Bimby?
Well, specifically, no, just Bemby Beach in this scenario.
How about, let me step back for a second, just say, I hear you, and how about we ask the law office for some clarification? Would that be helpful?
I think we need to, yeah.
Because I think that'd be helpful for myself too. And okay.
Yeah, and I do have some angst about projects that just hang on forever. You know, it does seem like there ought to be a timeout. Just like after you get your approvals, you have a certain amount of time to execute the project.
Yeah.
So if it's hanging on that long, it does feel to me, other than the APF or school, there's something else that's a problem.
The assumption is that the city is not the delaying factor, but the developer.
I don't know. I mean, it could be any one of a number of things. I don't think the city usually is the delaying factors in the sense that they're not processing applications and putting them through the process in a timely way. Sometimes the residents are a delaying factor.
Well, yeah, if someone, what is it,
We've
objects
heard of that a
and wants
little
to
bit.
appeal, then, so that's my point. If it's by no fault of ours or theirs, then what, But anyway, Dr. Nash, will you speak to the law department?
I will.
And see what we can come up with. Mr. Hyatt, would you like to speak again about, before we send this off to the law department for help?
Sure. The only thing I think is that I would suggest on top of that is how many projects specifically are we talking about? Because the way I read this, I think the Eastport Shopping Center would be caught up in it because, it would be effective. I mean, if there's no grandfathering, Eastport Shopping Center has site design plan approval, but they haven't put a footing in the ground, so I think they would be bound to it. And that project has been going on that may be as long as most, and, we've had appeals recently. So that's part of the problem. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why projects drag on. I admit the Bemby one is one of the longest ones that I've been involved in, but we had an expiration of a wetlands map, and so there's a new wetlands map that changed the location, and that is going to cause a couple of units to be lost. So it's. I understand the desire to adopt MPDU changes, but the significant harm that it causes projects that are reasonable in the pipeline, you can't just file an application without spending a lot of money and going back and forth in terms of design. So I think the grandfathering language in this legislation is appropriate. And I would simply ask Dr. Nash to let the committee know just how many projects are pending that would be impacted by this. The reality is Parole Place, we're going to supply MPDUs. We're not making a request for a fee in lieu. But it's been designed in a way with the expectation that we were going to have 15% for sale, and whatever it was on the rental, 6%, I think it was. So if you redesign, it's a lot of trouble. I mean, it's not something that should be taken lightly. So I think and I don't think there's a lot, but I'm thinking the several projects that might be impacted ought to be grandfathered. I think that's, and I hate to use the term fair because it sounds like a child, let's be fair, but I don't know how else to describe it because it's quite burdensome to submit an application and no, it's not always the city's fault, but there's plenty of delay that we incur going through the process in the city, and then we have to deal with the community, and we have to deal with appeals. It's not an easy process, and if you're talking about a handful, I don't think your goal would be frustrated, is all I'm saying. So that would be my request.
Thank you. And I use the term fair
I know.
because I feel that we
I
have
said
a
that to begin
responsibility.
with, but yeah.
I think we have a responsibility to
Right.
create laws that are fair.
Yep.
So, Mr. Alderman.
So, Alan, are you saying that you think the shopping center would be caught up in going from 12% to 15% and 15% from 6%? So it would increase the number of required MPDUs?
I think so. Yep. If it's not grandfathered, I think so.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
But, I mean, of course, that is the intent of the legislation.
Yeah.
They want more.
Okay, Alderman, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so pardon me for getting on my soapbox for a minute, but you know, when we talk about what's fair to the development industry, I think for me, you know where I stand, but for me, I want to think about, I think we need to think about what's fair for the voters, what's fair for our constituents. And our job's not to make sure that developers are making the most profit they can, it's to make sure that our residents can live here and have satisfying lives here and have a good quality of life. And I just think we need to keep that in perspective as, for me, that's the ultimate kind of fairness we need to keep in mind.
And I agree with you, actually. I think there's a need for affordable housing and moderately priced housing. And I hope you read my letter that I sent. There are many things better that the city council can do different than what's in this legislation. I think this is going to backfire on you, because if you have the burden on private developers and not allow them density bonuses and all the things that they need to make it work, you're not going to get the housing stock. I think what has to happen is something along the lines that has been approved in the county, where you allow for, as the county calls it, workforce housing, whatever you want to call it, affordable housing, but you have to allow it in various zones throughout the city, and you're going to have to permit greater density, because if you don't allow that, it's just not going to happen, and what you'll end up doing is really frustrate the purpose, because you'll stop all residential development, and then what you have left is just going to keep going up in price, and it will cut a lot of people out of the opportunity to own or rent. That's what's going to happen. I think you really need a more comprehensive view of this instead of doing it piecemeal, because you know, in the city code we have these height limitations, and Dr. Nash knows what I'm talking about. The townhouses today need 42 feet in height to be marketable, whether you're in Annapolis or the county or wherever. And what's been relied upon in the past is this 20% tolerance, because you have a 35-foot height limitation, and you get the 20% or 7 feet to get you up to 42 feet. That's been how these projects have gone forward. If that is eliminated, and I know it's a discretionary item, but let's say that's eliminated, you're going to lose the opportunity to generate your moderately priced dwelling units. I think much more consideration has to be entered into this equation than has been done. Yeah.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
yeah.
I think I would like to invite Mr. Hyatt to sit at the table rather than having you stand, because there's some other philosophical issues along that line that I really would like to discuss with the committee and get input from the staff and Mr. Hyatt if he so desires. But I'm concerned about these occupancy periods, and I'm concerned about the question that young man raised at the podium the other day, where he's saying that, you know, everybody else gets to build equity in their house, and when they sell it, they get to cash in. I would sit with Sally.
Oh, man.
So when we have this thing that you have to occupy it for 30 years, I've never occupied any house for, well, this is the longest I've ever been anywhere, and that's 17 years. So I've got 13 more years to go. And,
Right.
and if I wanted to sell it, my house, I bought it a lot more than I think it was worth, but I do think it's now worth twice that amount. And I don't know what happens. I'm certainly not willing to give up all that capital gain.
So let me say, you don't have to stay there for 30 years. But let me explain that the goal of this particular ordinance is to ensure that there is a certain amount of moderately priced dwelling units in circulation in the city at all times. The goal of this ordinance is not to help people build personal wealth through homeowner assistance, which is a worthy goal, and we do have other programs that help people do that. But like our first-time home buyers program. But so the goal of this is to ensure that even if someone is eligible for an MPDU now, buys an MPD unit, in 10 years, that property could be worth, market rate could be worth quite a bit more money than what they paid for it. Right. However, for the program to be successful, we want to make sure that stock remains in the mix as a moderately priced dwelling unit. And 10 years isn't really that long. So most jurisdictions have at least 30 years for their occupancy period. A lot of places have the 99 years for the rental, which is what we're proposing as well. So it's not out of line of what other jurisdictions do, and it's really just to ensure that that stock remains, even if people are able to then sell. This man could still sell his unit, but he couldn't sell it at market rate. He could only sell it for whatever increase there's been in the moderately priced dwelling unit program, which would be much smaller. So he would not be making the kind of investment if he bought the house at moderately priced dwelling unit rate and then sold only 10 years later at a much, much higher market rate value. That would be quite a wise financial investment, but not really fair for the intent of the program, which is to maintain this stock of moderately priced dwelling units.
Thank you for that clarification, and I appreciate it, but that none of that is here. So where is all of that other? Like, I have a friend that I race with that bought at Sailor's Quay, whatever it is. If after 10 years, he can then sell that unit at market rate. Mm-hmm. But if he sells it now, say, mm-hmm. What is the rate? How do we know what he can sell it for?
He just needs to check with our office, and it'll be close to what he paid for it. It doesn't go up that much. It goes up with cost of living and the region's average income levels, but it doesn't go up a lot.
But none of that is in code.
It is not in code, but it is in the MPDU documents that the homeowners and renters have to sign, and it is recorded in their deed.
Okay. But I think Alan raised a broader specter, which is, and that's why I wanted him to stay at the table. If we do this with laudable goals and goals that I support, I'm worried how many MPDUs developers will be enticed to put in place, but I'm also worried about how enticing it will be to get into the MPDU program. So I think it cuts both ways. And I don't have an answer. I have a worry, a concern. I want to make sure that we're going to do what we want the outcome to be, mm-hmm. and then pass this and find out, that didn't work. Where nobody is building MPD units anymore. They don't get this bonus or that bonus, or they can't get clients for it. Look how long we've had to clear the market on some of these units. that Sailor's Quay is really one of the examples. That
Right.
took a long time.
Well, we've learned some lessons since Sailor's Quay, and now we make sure that the MPD units are equivalent, really equivalent, to the other units in the development, and we didn't always do that. But I think you will see for the most part, this ordinance is in line with what other jurisdictions have done, especially Montgomery County, which granted is much bigger than us and can do a lot more things, with the exception of the fee in lieu, because almost every other jurisdiction does allow developers to pay a fee in lieu if they meet certain criteria. And that's when the council has to figure out, does this ordinance have the right mix of carrots and sticks? Because there's some situations where it is really would be quite impractical for someone to provide an MPDU, and I'm not sure how we will address that moving forward. Does that mean that development just doesn't happen, like you're saying? Or does it mean that they provide fewer units in order to be exempt from MPDUs? Is that what we want? That's a policy decision. But I would say there are, and I would agree that our fee in lieu right now is on the low side. I think we can look at if you wanted to keep the fee in lieu. I think there's different formulas we could look at from other jurisdictions that would ensure we get the kind of money that we could really use towards supporting the goals of this program. Then, it might be a worthwhile discussion to see if that is something you would like to keep in the existing legislation.
So the reason I wanted to hear from Mr. Hyatt is he not only represents people who are in the development business, but he represents a bank who is lending to people. So and obviously I recognize where you're coming from, but still I think you could give us some valuable insights as to whether you think this will accomplish the intended objectives.
I think on the rental side, if you've set aside a certain percentage of the community for MPDUs or workforce housing, whatever it's called, that's a permanent deal. I think that's fine, that's fair, everybody would expect it. But I think it's a great disincentive to buy a unit, whatever it may be, and give up the opportunity for appreciation and capital gain. I know that's not necessarily the purpose, but you really are taking away an opportunity from someone. They get an opportunity to buy a house or a condo, and 10 years is still a long time, but it's an incentive to hang in there and then sell it and reap the benefit and then buy something bigger and better. I don't know if I think financing becomes a real problem for those types of units when you're locked in for 30 years. I mean, that's a big disincentive, I think, from a
So how would
buyer.
a bank, someone comes to you for a loan to buy a unit in Sailor's Quay, and it has a 30-year, the property itself, would that affect your willingness to finance that borrower?
It would be concerning. I mean, the loan amount would have to be commensurate with the price as it exists today,
Right.
and probably a decent cushion of equity, unless it would qualify for an FHA type of a loan. I don't think any bank would want to assume that risk, to hold in this portfolio. I think it's a problem.
Sally, have we, as Dr. Natch, have we seen, when we were trying to clear the market for the for sale units, have we seen that aspect of it being a problem, or was it just the nature of the units? I know the one at Sailor's Quay had one bathroom for 2 bedrooms, and that was...
That was certainly a part of it. Also, at that time, too, our eligibility requirements were more restrictive than they are now. That was also an issue, just being able to find eligible candidates. So we've made improvements in both of those things.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we have decided to postpone action on this legislation. And Dr. Nash, you're going to bring several pieces of information back to us.
Well, just so you know, the 2010 West people do need action on this legislation by the end of the month.
There's only one more meeting.
Yes, and the next meeting is on Monday.
Right.
And why? What's the time?
For their financing, in order to get financing.
For whom? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
For the 2010 West Street, the affordable housing development.
They came before us.
Yeah, okay.
Is there something we can do for emergency legislation to help them in the short term? Like, what provision do they need?
They really just need the exemption. They need to be considered exempt from MPDUs.
Which is the sticking point that we're dealing with.
They need to be exempt from...
Well, from
But what
having
are
to
they-
provide MPDUs.
Are they currently? You're saying they're not exempt
They're
currently, right?
They're currently providing. We are currently asking them to provide MPDUs. They're saying that they can't get financing if they have to provide MPDUs because our MPDU program requires that you be a resident of the city, and their financing requires that the units have to be open to anyone who meets the income eligibility requirements, not restricted by geography.
Because that might be something easier to get past, is simply we'd be saying if they're already considered affordable housing per whatever state program, then they're exempt from our MPDU program, right? That's
Right.
essentially what we would need to do. And this does that, but this also does a lot of other things, which I get understanding you want to talk more about. And I don't even know if it has to go to other committees still. It probably has to go to Housing and Human Welfare. Have they postponed?
This was not referred to them. It was only referred to Planning Commission and rules.
No, all right. Well, it's kind of counterintuitive, but okay.
It's on our shoulders.
Well, while we're pondering this, I need to respond to the fairness comment that you made in
sure.
response to my fairness comment. I feel we make legislation for everyone. We don't make legislation for the developers, even though they are our constituents also. But we make legislation for all of our residents. And folks who are developing are our residents. You know, city folks own these properties. And sometimes we look to developers as if they're the evil people here doing us harm, when they represent our constituents and they represent our residents. So, you know, when we're talking fairness, it's not about being fair to developers, even though we should be fair to all businesses, regardless of what they bring to the city, but we should be fair to everybody in the city. So that's my perspective. Okay, I'm not, you know, I know there's this anti-development sentiment in the city, so be it. But, you know, I look at all of our residents and how we speak to everybody's needs, so.
Wait, I think right here in Title 23, it says developers are the evil people.
Yeah, you guys wrote that, right? So what can we do, Dr. Nash, because we really do need to get to this other legislation,
Well,
and
we
you need
really
to
do
lead.
want that 2000 or that 210 West Street. I mean, that's,
So how?
you and I have been working for years wanting to get more workforce housing.
Yeah, so what is it that we could do? Could we do a resolution? Would that suffice?
Well, there won't be time to introduce it.
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, Monday night, I don't know.
You have,
I'm just trying to find a way.
You have a special meeting on the 19th.
19th.
The work session or special?
There's a special meeting following a work session.
But that's a closed meeting with the
But
legal.
it's still a special city council meeting if you introduce something that night.
I also think the sponsors want this to go through, because I think of the positive aspects of this that I think we all support. I mean, we do want to make this kind of housing more available.
I agree. There's no question about that. The concern for me is the grandfathering piece. I'm good with the 2 amendments that we came up with from Planning Department, Dr. Nash.
Is that your only concern with it then, at the moment?
Yeah, it is.
Well, how about, I mean, the committee could still act on the rest of it, and even the amendment if Alderman Arnett felt like supporting it, but regardless, we could do everything but the amendment and still have it moved to the full council, right? If you're comfortable
Yes.
with the rest of
Yeah.
it. And then we could just talk about the amendment on the floor. Once we have
Okay.
information.
Once we get to the council meeting?
Once we can get the information from planning and zoning about what projects exactly would be
Right.
impacted, and also get clarification from the law office, and we could just bring that up on second reader.
I appreciate your flexibility on that. I think I would like to do that. We do need more information. I think the number of people that might be affected in the pipeline and that sort of thing, which we can get before the council meeting, but we can pass it without making that, making your amendment until we get more information.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
I
That would
will
be, I appreciate that.
entertain a motion to give a favorable recommendation to O2119 with the 3 amendments, the 2 planning commission's recommendations and the Rodriguez amendment.
Well, that substituted one of the planning commission.
Right.
Actually,
Oh, that's right, okay,
We
yeah.
changed both of the planning
So-
commission meetings.
So it's the Rodriguez amendment and well, we can't say it's Dr.
Plan-
Nash's amendment. She can't amend that legislation.
Planning and zoning recommendation.
Yeah.
It'll be your,
It'll be ours. It'll be
Okay, it'll be our,
It's
okay.
yours,
There you go.
Okay,
I'll give it
so
to
it'll
you.
be the rules committee
Yeah, the rules
recommendation.
committee
but you
recommendation.
never did number 1 for planning commission. You said you were going to come back
No,
to.
we changed that to the Rodriguez amendment, did we not?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're not recommending either of the planning commission
Exactly.
recommendations.
Right,
We're recommending instead the Rodriguez amendment
and then the rules
and the
committee.
rules committee amendment.
Yes.
All right.
So is that the
So the
motion?
motion is to
Yeah.
recommend favorable approval with the 2 rules and city government amendments.
Second.
Okay. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, 031, and I know this is coming up on the agenda for Monday night also. Thank you, Mr. Hyatt.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nash, are you speaking to this? You're not speaking to this one, are you? This city council meeting? No.
But run while you can.
This is the one that speaks to the time limit for speakers at council meetings. Alderman?
Yeah, so just to get the ball rolling here, since I need to go very soon. I think we all supported this unanimously, but at least for me, I've heard from some residents in the city, and I think they're taking this the wrong way. I think our intention was to allow for more people to come testify, but it sounds like the public really kind of wants their 5 minutes. I'm kind of at this point like to know the thoughts here, but I'm from you two, but I'm kind of inclined to withdraw my support from it, at least to push an unfavorable recommendation. And I know Alderman Arnett's looked at some other efficiency measures that I think we could implement to help meet the goal of both allowing for more testimony, so we don't have testimony very late in the night, but also just improve general efficiency of the meeting. But I would like to hear what you two are thinking.
Alderman Arnett, you want to speak to it?
Sure. So you remember this came up under the last administration, and all that needed to be done was for the administration to propose a change to the ordinance to go from 5 minutes to 3 minutes, and the administration never did that. So it stayed It's always been 5 minutes in the code. However, in the previous administrations before the last one, we'll just name it the Cohen administration and the Moyer administration, which you and I were part of, we always did it in 3 minutes with 5 minutes for people representing a group. That wasn't in code, but that's what we did. And at every meeting, the council does have the right at the beginning of the meeting to change the rules of procedure for that meeting because of time considerations or whatever else. But to me, the interesting part is if you go look at the code, and I'm not being able to put my hand on it right now, it calls for 2 city council meetings. The regular meeting is for legislation, and the special meeting has always been for public hearings. And the special meeting, the agenda for the special meeting is specifically given to the mayor, and I believe, and this is what Alderman Israel told me, it was because the mayor was supposed to be the traffic cop. You can't just have endless hours of public testimony on anything, the so-called open night meeting. So I think there would be an alternative, which would be to have a legislative meeting where we hear legislation and then have a special meeting where we hear from the public. And the advantage of that, as it's laid out, as I think it's laid out in the code, the advantage of that is lots of times we'll hear public hearing testimony at the very meeting where we're making the vote. How much did committees take into consideration the public testimony or us on the fly while we're voting? So I think there is a logic to separating these into its 2 components, and that logic actually lives right in the code. So I think that I'm also uncomfortable. I also have been hearing from my constituents that they have precious little time with us, even though I know we all do spend time with them. They don't think it's enough. And I think that maybe we need to take just a second thought about this. So I don't even remember whether I'm a sponsor of this or not, but I don't
think we
want to
all
be a
are.
sponsor. We all are. I also want a timeout. So I would recommend that we go back and look at the code and see what it has set up for the council meetings and see if there isn't some wisdom there.
I came on city council when you did.
Yes, you did.
And yes, previous administrations had 3 minutes. And then the last previous administration changed it to 5.
Well, they followed the code.
And following the code. But there was another reason that we don't need to get into. We are not denying anyone the opportunity to provide testimony to us. It is unfair for the community, as well as us, to hear people who want to repeat the same things over and over at every setting. And we're going through that right now with some of our legislation. If you look at the county, and yes, Ms. Sutherland, I'm using the county as an example now. They give you 2 minutes.
And they stick to it.
And they stick to it. And you don't hear any complaints about that. And that is for the county. They're a little bit bigger than we are, so they have, and if I'm not mistaken, you can only speak on a subject 1 time. Is that correct, Ms. Sutherland? No. Yes or no? Yes and no. You either can speak on things more than once or you can't.
Nope, that's not true. So, they introduce a bill, they have a public hearing on the bill, and you may speak on the bill.
Okay.
The night of the public hearing, they have to vote on the bill. They either vote on it or they amend it. If they amend it, they must re-advertise it, and they then have a public hearing on the bill as amended.
Okay.
So you could speak on the original bill, you can speak on the bill as amended.
Okay.
The night they have the hearing on the bill as amended, it's up for vote again. They vote on it,
Okay.
or they amend it again. If they amend it again, they re-advertise. There's another public hearing on the bill as amended. So that continues until they get to the vote. And the difference is, at the county, anything pretty much other than a typographical amendment is substantive.
Is what?
Substantive. They don't, they amend a bill, it's amended, and they re-advertise it, and they have another public hearing. So depending how many times a bill is amended is how many opportunities you might have to speak. If it's never amended, you would have one.
Okay, so you can only speak a second time if it's amended.
Correct.
Okay.
Question about that? So if once a bill's been introduced in the county, can somebody come during the general public comment and comment on that bill, or do they have
Not
to
if
wait
it's
for
on the agenda. So their public comment is limited to things that are not on the agenda. So a
Right.
bill gets introduced the first Monday. It gets advertised the next day, Tuesday. Has to be advertised for at least 14 days, so it doesn't make it up for public hearing at the next meeting, because that's not 14 days, that's not 14, that's 13. Okay? So it's usually heard a month later, unless there are 5 Mondays in a month. That interim meeting, somebody could come and speak because it's not on the agenda. Likewise, if they have the public hearing, they close the public hearing, but somebody makes a motion to not vote on it that night, comes up at the next meeting, it's on the agenda. It's not on the agenda for public hearing. Public hearing's closed. You cannot comment during the general comment on it because it's on the agenda. So that keeps people, once the public hearing has been closed, from continuing to comment on a bill by taking advantage of the general comment period.
I-
Chair, I'm really sorry, I need to go.
I know. I think that, do you want to vote on, you?
Well, how are you, what do you think you're
I'm
going to do?
supportive of it. And he's shaking his head on this side, like I can't see him out of the corner of my eye.
I'm not supportive of it at this time. I think there's other ways to go.
Well, I mean, I do agree there are other things we could do. But that's different legislation. This is what we have before us for the 3 minutes. At this point, I'm inclined to explore alternatives first.
Well, there's
Especially since, like, I think the original hope was that we'd get everybody on board, so this was unanimous from the council, but if
And we did.
we did. But there,
Okay, so you want to make a motion to take no action on this or postpone action? It's not a time certain.
Postpone. I move that we postpone and take it up at our next Rules Committee meeting.
No, take it up at somebody else's meeting. Sorry. No, I'm kidding. That was a joke. That was a joke. Is that a
I'll
second?
second the postponement.
Okay, all in favor of postponing action on 031, please say aye.
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 Aye. Okay, and the last one is critical area overlay fees. Is this time sensitive?
I move we recommend approval. It's only 50, 60
Well,
pages.
well, no, this is just the
No, it's
fee
just
legislation.
one.
But can I make Dr. Nash, I think, has said that it's not, previously, that it's not time sensitive, because I spoke to her about postponing it on environmental matters, which is tomorrow, and she said it's fine.
Dr. Nash, can we postpone this
It's the critical area
overlay fee?
fee in lieu.
Okay, so motion to postpone.
Motion to postpone the
Second.
R39, 3619.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, I think that exhausts our agenda. Motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
Second, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Here it is, this